Well, welcome to the YouTube version of the sermon for the 10th of May, and it's good to be with you. This is video primarily for the folk of Whitley Lodge Baptist Church, of which I have the privilege of serving as pastor, albeit somewhat remotely at the moment, but you're more than welcome to listen in and take from it what you find useful. Just a couple of things by way of letting you know what's going on. This coming week, we will have prayer meeting on Facebook Live on Tuesday. House group, my house group meeting on Zoom on Wednesday. Thursday, it's going to be a quiz. We had 42 last week, so it's quiz week this week. And we will wait and see what the government determines we're able to do. Lynn said to me this morning, do you think you should get some water and damp down your hair? And I said the other alternative is to give it up as a bad job. I've very much decided on the latter. So here we are. I wanted to be a little bit indulgent this morning. I'm going to do something which I hope you won't regard as being all about me, but in thinking about the work and ministry of the Holy Spirit, I thought, why not just tell people about your experiences over the years, and then they can make of that what they will. So that's what I plan to do, probably over 2 weeks actually, because there's an awful lot of material there. And this week, certainly in the Facebook church, we're going to be sharing communion. I do encourage you, if you haven't downloaded Facebook and don't use it, there's a whole load more of stuff you can join in with, and also with Zoom. I thought I'd just read to you from a thing by Andy Rain, one of the leading lights in the Northumberland community, that he wrote for the 8th of May, just a couple of days ago, in the Coleman readings for 8th of May, entitled "The Small Boats." And of course, that has obvious resonances in terms of Dunkirk and so on. Some years ago, in intercession, we were warned of a rising tide of the Spirit that would change the landscape all around. People who had previously never been isolated would suddenly find themselves alone on small islands, surprised, bewildered, cut off from familiar demands and expectations, learning just to seek God. What do they need? These new island dwellers so suddenly alone. They may feel isolated, but actually they are more linked by the tide of the Spirit. A small boat that appears. In the boat are willing friends, bringing much needed encouragement and carefully chosen supplies. They also point out and recognise the resources already there, unnoticed and unharnessed in that place. God has prepared us for such a time as this. Are you willing to be anointed for this task of encouragement? So I just thought that was interesting link up to where we are now, particularly as we think about the story of Dunkirk and then subsequently the ending of the Second World War. But that wasn't really what I set out to do this morning. I'm going to tell you a little bit, the first part of my various experiences of the Holy Spirit. I'm hoping that you'll find this useful and regard it as a piece of gratuitous self-indulgence. I also wanted to say, incidentally, that I think that from ministers working in lockdown, there are two approaches. The one approach says, let's focus on this isolation thing. Let's focus on the current crisis and minister directly into that. And the other approach says, we are where we are, and we are doing what we're doing, and let's try and keep life as normal as we possibly can. And I've very much adopted the latter approach. I'm trying to make church as normal as possible, whilst at the same time acknowledging that we are in an unusual situation. And perhaps more the Tuesday prayer meeting, we focus on things to do with the coronavirus crisis. Anyway, that's enough preamble. It's taken me 5 minutes to get there. My experience of the Holy Spirit, part 1. I hope you'll be interested enough to come back for part 2 next week. I was converted when I was 15. It was a wonderful thing because life would have been a disaster otherwise. And 2 years later, I was baptized. And in those days, in order to be baptized, you first of all went to like half a dozen inquirers classes with the minister. And then if you wanted to proceed with baptism, you went to another 6 classes called baptismal classes. I did both because A, I wanted to be baptized, and B, because there was a girl in the baptismal classes who I rather fancied. She didn't, unfortunately, fancy me. Anyway, in all of these classes, preparing me for baptism and for a Christian existence, I still have the notes, or at least I did until, maybe they'd been lost in the house move somewhere, but until recently I had the notes, and there is not a single mention of the Holy Spirit. We just didn't cover the Holy Spirit, which, as I've said before, is a little bit like selling someone a car and not telling them how you put fuel in it. The other thing about church was that church was very boring. I mean, there's no other word for it. Every time I went to church, I got bored. The minister preached fairly good sermons, but to be honest, it was tedious, and I did it twice on a Sunday as a new Christian. I'd been compelled to do it earlier as a child of Christian parents. And when I was about 17, a number of things happened, one of which was I was called to ministry. I was absolutely convinced that God had told me I was going to be a minister. Nobody else thought so at the time, but I was absolutely convinced. And my mission was, I don't want church to be boring. Now, around about the same time, you see, a number of other things were happening. I became friends with a bunch of young people in my church who had, as it were, other strings to their bow. And I discovered that they went to different meetings at the weekend. Particularly, they went to Youth for Christ. And we had a visit from an American evangelist called Arthur Blessed, whose preaching really fired me up. And they started talking about the Holy Spirit. And they started talking about being full of the Holy Spirit. And they started talking about things like speaking in tongues. I got to know a bunch of people who formed themselves into what became, I think they called it Small Heath Community Church, which was an independent charismatic church based in the road where Lynn and I, when we were first married, went to live. And in their the meetings they had in various people's houses in these great big Victorian terraces, they did things like speaking in tongues, and they got excited and they got enthusiastic. And it was a million miles removed from life of church as I knew it. And I said, this is what I want. I said, it's wonderful. Church doesn't have to be boring. And it was linked very much with the ministry and the work of the Holy Spirit, about whom I'd heard absolutely nothing previously. We used to take ourselves off to a place called Hockley Penty. Hockley, I think it was an Elim church in Hockley near central Birmingham, run by 2 women who didn't actually preach because they thought that was unbiblical, but they led the service and then they got a man to preach for whatever reason. But anyway, this church was just full of life and vitality. People got filled and baptized with the Holy Spirit, as they called it, which was an overwhelming emotional experience of being drenched, as it were, in the Holy Spirit. And it was all about speaking in tongues. You see, they said very clearly that when you are filled with the Spirit, you will speak in tongues. And I didn't know about any of this because nobody had ever taught me. But I knew I wanted what they had. And so I went home one day. I knelt by my bed. I opened my Bible. I asked God to show me where the bit about speaking in tongues was. I thought it was in 1 Corinthians somewhere. I found 1 Corinthians 12. I said, God, I want this. And this is going to sound very mechanical and very unspiritual. But I just, as I knelt down my bed, I just started speaking nonsense words, what seemed to me nonsense words that I started speaking, and the words just came, and I didn't understand a thing about what I was saying. Words just tumbled out of my mouth. And I've been doing it ever since, to be honest. Sometimes in my Christian life more than others. Sometimes it's almost dried up. Sometimes it happens a lot. I find it incredibly useful when I'm praying for people and I don't quite know how to pray for them. I use this language, and if I'm really, I'm just being really honest about this. And some will say, well, it's not real speaking in tongues. Well, I wouldn't know about that, but I just use this language when I pray for people. And I've been using it since the age of 17, and I still use it. I think sometimes people are looking for some kind of mystical thing that happens when, completely beyond their control, they start speaking a language they don't understand. And I think that does happen to people, but it didn't happen to me. For me, the gift of tongues is all about speaking these nonsense words. I'm not going to do a demonstration. I think that would be the wrong thing to do. But in those days, it was all about speaking in tongues, and that was the mark. But some things didn't quite resonate in all of this. And I went to a different Pentecostal church once, where the Pentecostal theology at the time was that the mark of being baptized in the Spirit, which is this necessary second experience that you had to have, you had to be baptized in the Spirit, and the way you knew you'd been baptized in the Spirit was you spoke in tongues. And I went to this meeting where, and a young man, I went to talk to one of the leaders, and I just overheard the conversation. And he was obviously been really, really blessed by this meeting. He'd been touched and he'd been really enthused, and his face was alight, and he was just full of joy. And the person he went to see said, well, if you haven't spoken in tongues, you haven't got it. And something in me said, something ain't right there. This was long before I had any kind of a theological education. But anyway, so I started speaking in tongues. And more significantly, I came to understand that worship and church was about engaging with the emotions as well as with the mind. And I've always, ever since then, I've believed that church is a balance of heart and mind. It's the Holy Spirit teaches us, so our understanding improves. We take things in with our ears and into our mind, but also our heart's engaged, so our emotions are driven. And one of my frustrations, and it's an ongoing frustration, is that so often churches go for one or the other. And I say, no, you can have both. You can be filled with the Spirit, you can be enthused, you can have an emotional experience of God by the Spirit, as well as learning with your head. And actually, you need both things. Eventually, I persuaded my church that God had called me to ministry, or at least I think God persuaded them. And I had to mature, and the time came to go off to theological college. I went to Spurgeon's College in London, and those of you who might be watching this who are former friends of mine from college may or may not be surprised to learn that I went through college feeling inferior. I excelled at sports. That was what I was good at, and that was where I demonstrated my prowess, and in a sense compensated for my lack of feeling. I mean, academically I was okay, but in terms of gifts as a preacher, as a potential minister, I always felt inferior, and the college really helped me to overcome that. But in college, I discovered an immense range of view about the work of the Holy Spirit, and particularly about the gifts of the Holy Spirit. There were those who said that the gifts of the Spirit and the baptism of the Holy Spirit, as it were, the experience of being filled with the Holy Spirit, that is, those things died out with the early church. We don't have them any longer. And so the gifts of healing and miracles and so on, and words of knowledge and prophecy, these things have gone because we have the Bible and we don't need them anymore. And at the other extreme were the people who said, it's really important that you get filled with the Holy Spirit, baptized with the Holy Spirit. You have this wonderful experience. And even some of them would probably have said, it's really important you speak in tongues as well. But I think eventually I came to a more balanced view, which I suppose is the one that more or less I've had ever since, about the ministry of the Holy Spirit. In all of this, you see, my feeling about the Holy Spirit, my passion was that church should not be boring. When people go to church, they should be enthused and excited, engaged. They should participate in church rather than just sit there, and their hearts should be stirred, and their minds should be fed, and there should be decent coffee as well. And this has always been my view. I went to America for a year where I learned to keep my mouth shut, because they were all dispensationalists and they believed that if you spoke in tongues, you were essentially demonic. So I kept my mouth shut. But my mission was always, I recognized that the ministry of the Holy Spirit, engaging heart and mind together, was essential if the church was going to thrive. So I went to my first church in Sudbury, and there I followed a lovely man who had ministered faithfully for 24 years, but in a very traditional format. And he would probably have inclined towards the view that we don't really do the spiritual gifts thing now. It's about hymns, it's about preaching and so on, but they knew they had to change. And gradually I introduced teaching about the Holy Spirit. I gradually introduced more freedom in worship, more engagement of people, more open prayer, more open worship, praying for people, praying for healing, praying for miracles, and so on. The great influence at this time, particularly in that part of the world, was a church called St Andrew's in Chorley Wood, led by David Pitches, an Anglican church where people were having phenomenal experiences about the Holy Spirit. John Wimber was around at this time. It's the sort of Wimber era in the 80s. Where there were signs and there were wonders, and this chap John Wimber, this Californian preacher who'd been a former rock musician, I think, he was experiencing people being touched in amazing ways by the Holy Spirit, and he was experiencing miracles, healings, and so on. And St Andrew's Chorley Wood was influenced by this. And from time to time, Lynn and I used to sneak off to St Andrew's, Chorley Wood, where people would be prayed for and they would fall over. Except Lynn and I, we would go and be prayed for, we wouldn't fall over. Everybody else would fall over under the power of the Holy Spirit. And I think, why not me? Lynn, why not me? But it didn't happen. But it did at St Andrew's, Chorley Wood, and there were clearly signs that the Holy Spirit was doing amazing things there. And bit by bit, Sudbury Baptist Church became more and more, if you're familiar with the term, more and more charismatic, more and more freedom in worship, more and more people praying, more people engaged in what was going on, livelier worship. We sang songs sometimes 3 times as opposed to twice. was a fair amount of opposition from people who preferred the old ways, but the church grew and thrived, and lots of good things happened. People became Christians. While later, it was time to move on, and I went to Toaster Baptist Church, and I went there very much as a, if you like, a charismatic evangelical. I made it very clear to the church that I was committed to what was called the renewal movement, which meant introducing spirit-filled worship, introducing gifts of the Spirit, encouraging it. I mean, quite a lot of people in the church were already there, but that, if I came as their minister, that was where it was going to go. And so I had a clear mandate to do that. And Toaster Baptist Church, in a sense, thrived, but in particular, the supernatural ministry of the Holy Spirit was perhaps more evident there than I've ever known it in my ministry. A particular couple arrived who came from a charismatic church in South Wales, and I'm not going to name them because some people watching this will probably know who I mean. They were an amazing couple, and they kept bringing people into the church who became converted and who became, if you want, experienced being filled with the Holy Spirit. We experienced a number of miraculous things and a number of healings and, as John Wimber would call them, signs and wonders. I'm not going to go into an enormous amount of detail, other than to share a couple of experiences with you, which I think demonstrate how genuine what was happening was. We have a friend who's a Swiss girl called Sonia, who was living with us, and she came to stay with us for 6 months and then came back at regular intervals, has been coming back ever since, now with a husband and 2 children. But we took her, before she was married, we took her to York for a few days, and we took our caravan and we went to St Michael le Belfry, which was the home church, it's not the home church, but the church where David Watson had ministered. Now, David Watson was influenced significantly by John Wimber. They became good friends, and David Watson was very much involved in signs and wonders, the ministry and the fullness of the Holy Spirit, and so on. And St Michael le Belfry became a centre of this, as well as the home of the Riding Lights Theatre Company, another big influence on my life. And we thought it'd be great to go to St Michael le Belfry. I mean, David Watson had died long before this. And so we went there, and cut a long story short, at the end of the service, Sonia, who knew nothing about the whole business of falling over and being filled with the Spirit, she said she'd like to go and talk to somebody who'd led the service because she had a couple of questions she wanted to ask. And so Sonia trotted off. Her English was excellent. And when we saw her, she was sitting down on the steps at the front of this big old Anglican church where Guy Fawkes was christened, incidentally, chatting to a lady who was a very nice lady, but what I would term a member of the Blue Rinse Brigade. And we thought, oh, well, that's safe enough. She'll be okay there. And the next time we turned around and looked, Sonia was literally sprawled across the steps of the church because this lady had prayed for her. She'd just gone out like a light. She didn't know anything about it. And for the next, Sonia just lay there. She was just basking in the presence of God. And eventually they were closing the church up. We had to sort of drag her out along with our 4 children. And she walked through the streets of York with her arms like this in the air and her eyes closed, and we had to sort of steer her. She was literally drunk with the Spirit. Those sorts of things happened. And the other thing that is worth mentioning was I wanted to learn to play the keyboard well in terms of a worship band as opposed to playing it as a solo musician. And the couple that I mentioned recommended to me a musical day that their old church in South Wales was having. So I went down to South Wales and I learned how you were supposed to play the keyboard properly. Of course, implementing it is another matter, but I learned how I was supposed to do it. Anyway, cut a long story short, when I was coming back, somewhere between Ross-on-Wye and the M5, God spoke to me. I knew it was God because A, he was saying something I didn't want to hear, and B, I just had this awfully sick sensation in my stomach. And what God was saying to me was, tomorrow, because this was a Saturday, tomorrow at church, I want you to invite people to come out to the front and to pray for them to receive the Holy Spirit. And I was sick to my stomach. I just didn't want to do this because I knew that there were people in the church who would metaphorically, if not literally, walk out. This would create a major problem with the people who felt that charismatic renewal in Towcester had already gone too far without introducing this circus as they would see it. The voice was insistent and it wouldn't shut up. And it was one of those times, and there have not been all that many in my life, when I knew God was speaking. And I knew I had to do this, and I had a choice. God said to me, do you want to keep me happy? Or do you want to keep these people in your church happy? What's it to be? And this is the kind of crisis that most ministers face at one time or another. And I said, if I have a choice between pleasing God and pleasing people, God must win. Otherwise, I've abandoned my ministry. And so I hardly slept that night. I was terrified. And the point came in the service where I said, we're going to pray. Anybody who wants prayer to receive the Holy Spirit, please come out. I'm going to indulge in another confession, and anybody listening from Towcester will probably smile. And I hope the young lady concerned doesn't mind me mentioning her Christian name. So when I said, come out and we'll pray for you to receive the Holy Spirit, a number of people came out, and I invited one or two people to help me pray, but mainly I did it. And the principle was I wasn't going to push anybody over. I was just going to very lightly touch their heads. And I made a beeline for a girl called Dawn, because I knew that she was so receptive to the Spirit and she'd been prayed for, and all sorts of things had happened to her. So I went for Dawn. I hope you don't mind if you're listening to this, Dawn. And I just touched Dawn, and like that, she was out on the floor. And I thought, that's an encouraging start. So I worked my way along the line, and lo and behold, most people ended up in a heap on the floor. And honestly, I didn't push anybody. And it was God's way of saying, well done, you were obedient to me. Of course, the fallout was horrific. And a number of people left the church soon afterwards. And I had an awful lot of flack. But it was a significant moment. Now, in all of this, in all of the good things that were happening, I also started experiencing some unease. Because, you see, the one thing I was sure about the ministry of the Holy Spirit was that the experience of the Holy Spirit, accompanied by such signs as this, is given us for a purpose. It's not like relaxing in a hot bath and simply enjoying an experience. It's given us for a purpose. And if you say, I asked God, what are you doing with Sonia after the experience in York? And what God said was, I'm preparing her for what comes. And Sonia's not had the easiest time living in Switzerland, but God has been her strength and her rock and her support. And I'm told she's even started doing some preaching. It was for a purpose. It was to equip her. And I understood that the ministry of the Holy Spirit was to equip us, and particularly to equip us for mission. And I looked at the first chapter of Acts, where Jesus promises the Holy Spirit and says, you won't be any good in mission until you receive the Holy Spirit. And I came to realize that the Holy Spirit was given to empower the church in mission. And therefore, if God was giving us the Holy Spirit, it was in order that we could do mission. And indeed, the gift of speaking in tongues was given for mission. By the time speaking in tongues happens in 1 Corinthians 12, it appears to be something slightly different, more for personal edification and building up. But in Acts 2, what is going on is that people are speaking in tongues because there's lots and lots of people, lots of different languages, and the disciples the apostles as they then were able to communicate in their own language. And so I said to the church, look, God is blessing us with the Holy Spirit, but it isn't so we can relax in a warm bath and say, isn't this wonderful? It is so that we can be engaged in mission. I wanted the fullness of the Holy Spirit to be a springboard for mission. The problem was that there were so many people who seemed to want to simply seek for the next experience. And so I prayed about this and I challenged the church. I said, look, we have to be involved practically in faith and in practice for outreach to our town. And I challenged the church to do this. In the same time, the people who were at the forefront, many of the people who were at the forefront of the experience collecting, if you like, were the people who were simply looking for the next experience and weren't really hearing me when I said this is about mission. And when I talked to God about this, God said something to me that I believe God said something which was very painful. It was these experiences will dry up if the church is not obedient to what I'm saying. And essentially, that's what happened. I lay a challenge before the church. The next step, it was a challenge which required faith. Stepping out, it required financial commitment. It required trusting God and stepping out in faith. And I laid it before the church, and the church essentially declined it. And perhaps I didn't present it well. I don't know. And God said to me, the blessings are going to dry up. And the blessings dried up. And people started looking elsewhere for their blessings. They'd heard that in Northampton there were people experiencing having gold fillings in their teeth. And whether or not this was true or not, I don't know. It may well be. You can well believe it. But they'll be going off looking for the next experience. And I just know this, God has given us so much. It has to be about mission. And I realized two things about the, if you like, the reality of the situation of seeking to experience the Holy Spirit. One is that people were not really committed to reaching the town for Jesus at all, and they weren't seeing the gifts and the ministry of the Holy Spirit as being for that purpose. And the second thing I realized was that so many of the words that came out of their mouth were just words. They would use terms like stepping out in faith, but actually they weren't prepared to do it. And in 1997, I had a massive crisis. It suddenly dawned on me that the ministry of the Holy Spirit, which I've been so keen to emphasize and to encourage, had actually had the effect of enabling people to live a kind of false life. and come out with words, but words that were not backed by actions, and that people didn't really understand what the ministry of the Holy Spirit was really about. I had the huge crisis. Very kindly, some people arranged for me to, and thus my love affair with Northumberland to some extent. I was sent by my wife with my golf clubs, my bicycle, in the car, to Holy Island for a week, where I spent Holy Island for 3 days, then the Northumbria community for 3 days. I spent most of the first 3 days crying and shouting at God and asking God why, and becoming incredibly disillusioned. And after 3 days, when God had, as I saw it, said nothing to me, I said, "That's it, I'm finished. I've had it. I'm finishing in ministry. I'm not even going to be a Christian anymore. I've just had it. I've had enough. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm not going to be a minister anymore because I can't carry on like this." I think I was quite close to a breakdown. I was disillusioned and very sad. I wept an awful lot because I think what had happened in those previous few weeks was that my idealism, my dream of what the church could be, had died. That sounds awfully depressing. It didn't end there, but I think I had to get to that point. And I'm going to leave you with the point where I'd taken the decision one evening that I had finished with ministry. I'd probably finished with being a Christian, for that matter. And to celebrate, I decided to get in the car and drive across the causeway and down to Sea Houses and have pie and chips, because I don't like fish, so I don't do fish and chips. I was going to eat my pie and chips down by the harbour in Sea Houses and celebrate the end of ministry and the end of my life as a Christian. And I'll tell you what happened. Still makes me cry. I'll explain to you what happened by the harbour in Sea Houses next time round. Thanks for listening. I better stop or I'll start crying.